In 1899, the most exclusive address in Manhattan was not a Fifth Avenue mansion where society matrons held their glittering balls. It was a four-story brownstone on East 44th Street, where railroad magnates and Wall Street speculators slipped through unmarked doors to lose entire fortunes before the sun rose over the city. The house belonged to Richard Canfield, a self-educated former convict who had somehow transformed an illegal gambling operation into something resembling a private museum for the American aristocracy. Critics in the newspapers called it a palace of vice that corrupted the morals of the city's most powerful men. The patrons themselves called it the finest private club in America, with cuisine rivaling Delmonico's restaurant next door and artwork worthy of any European gallery. This is the story of the Canfield Casino, the illegal empire that seduced the Gilded Age elite and then vanished almost completely without a trace. Richard Albert Canfield was born in 1855 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling port that had once been among the wealthiest cities in America. By the time of his birth, the industry was already declining. Petroleum had begun replacing whale oil in lamps across the country. The great fortunes built on hunting leviathans were slowly evaporating. Canfield entered the world just as one era of American wealth was ending and another was about to begin. His father worked as a mechanic and sometimes salesman, providing a modest but respectable existence for the family. The Canfields were not poor, but they possessed none of the advantages that smoothed the path for children of prosperous families. There was no money for private academies or university education. There were no family connections to secure apprenticeships with established firms. Whatever Richard Canfield would become, he would have to build it himself. The boy received only a basic public school education before circumstances forced him into the workforce. He took whatever jobs a young man without connections could find, but Canfield possessed something that no classroom could provide and no employer could take away. He had an insatiable hunger for books and an extraordinary memory for everything he read. While other boys his age spent their evenings in taverns or chasing girls through the streets, Canfield haunted the local library. He read voraciously and without system at first: novels, histories, biographies, scientific treatises. He consumed everything he could find. Gradually, his tastes refined themselves. He developed a particular interest in philosophy, especially the German metaphysicians who were fashionable among educated Europeans. He read Kant and Hegel and found them stimulating but abstract. Then he discovered Arthur Schopenhauer, the great pessimist who viewed human existence as fundamentally tragic. Something in that bleak worldview resonated with the young man from the declining whaling port. By his teenage years, Canfield had discovered a second passion that would define his life alongside literature. He found that he possessed a natural gift for gambling, not the reckless gambling of desperate men hoping to transform their circumstances with a single lucky hand. Canfield approached cards and dice with the same analytical intensity he brought to philosophy. He studied odds and probabilities. He calculated expected values. He learned to read the subtle signals that players unconsciously broadcast when they held strong or weak hands. These two interests might seem contradictory. One suggested refinement, intellectual discipline, the life of the mind. The other suggested vice, moral compromise, the exploitation of human weakness. Canfield apparently saw no conflict between them. He would spend his mornings with Schopenhauer, contemplating the futility of human striving. He would spend his evenings calculating the house edge on faro and watching grown men destroy themselves at the tables. Perhaps the philosopher helped him understand the gamblers. Perhaps the gamblers confirmed what the philosopher taught. In his early 20s, Canfield drifted from New Bedford to Boston, seeking larger opportunities in the bigger city. He found work in small gambling establishments that operated in the shadows of the law. He started as a dealer, the lowest position in the hierarchy, learning the mechanics of every game from the inside. Faro, poker, roulette, hazard. He mastered the technical details of each, understanding exactly how the odds favored the house, and by what margin. But Canfield studied more than cards and wheels. He studied the players themselves with the same intensity he had once brought to German philosophy. He noticed which men could afford to lose, and which were betting money they desperately needed. He observed how alcohol loosened judgment and inflated confidence. He watched how pride prevented sensible men from walking away when they were behind. He saw how the wealthy treated gambling as entertainment, while the desperate treated it as salvation. Both groups lost in the end, but they lost differently. He also observed the establishments themselves with a critical eye. Most gambling houses of the era were crude operations. The rooms were dingy and poorly ventilated. The clientele mixed respectable businessmen with criminals and confidence men. Cheating was common, sometimes by the house itself. Fights broke out regularly. Police raids occurred whenever the bribes stopped flowing. The entire atmosphere suggested degradation and danger. Canfield began to imagine something different. What if a gambling establishment could be operated like a gentleman's club? What if the rooms were elegant and the service impeccable? What if the games were scrupulously honest and the clientele carefully selected? What if a man could lose a fortune in an atmosphere of such refinement that the experience felt almost civilized? The wealthy had proven willing to pay premium prices for premium experiences in every other area of life. Why should gambling be different? By 1876, Canfield had saved enough money to test his theory. He opened a small gambling operation in Providence, Rhode Island. The venture was modest in scale, but ambitious in concept. Canfield furnished the rooms with taste and kept them scrupulously clean. He enforced strict rules against drunkenness and disorder. He hired dealers who dressed well and treated patrons with respect. The games were honest. The house edge was sufficient without being greedy. The experiment did not last long enough to prove itself. That same year, police raided the establishment and arrested Canfield on gambling charges. Whether the raid resulted from insufficient bribes or political pressure or simple bad luck, the records do not clearly indicate. A judge sentenced him to 6 months in the Providence jail. At 21 years old, Canfield was a convicted criminal. For most young men, such a sentence would have been a catastrophe. A prison term meant permanent exclusion from respectable society. It meant difficulty finding legitimate employment. It meant shame that would follow a man for the rest of his life. Canfield apparently viewed his situation differently. If respectable society was closed to him, he would build his own world outside it, and he would use his time in prison productively. The Providence jail had a library. It was not extensive, but it contained enough volumes to occupy an intellectually hungry prisoner for 6 months. Canfield read systematically through the collection. He continued his study of philosophy and history. He read works on art and architecture, subjects he had previously neglected. He absorbed information about wine and cuisine, the markers of cultivated taste that wealthy men deployed to distinguish themselves from the merely prosperous. He also read biographies of successful men, looking for patterns he could apply to his own circumstances. He noticed that many great fortunes had been built by men who operated in moral gray zones. The railroad barons had bribed legislators and crushed competitors through methods that skirted legality. The industrial magnates had exploited workers and manipulated markets. Compared to such men, a gambling operator who ran honest games and paid his bribes on time seemed almost respectable. When Canfield emerged from prison in 1877, he possessed something far more valuable than a clean record. He understood how rich men lived and what they expected from their pleasures. He knew their tastes in art and wine and food. He could discuss literature and philosophy with genuine knowledge. He had studied their world from the outside and prepared himself to serve their desires from the inside. Canfield returned to gambling immediately, but now he operated with greater sophistication. He opened a new establishment in Providence that catered explicitly to wealthy clientele. The rooms were decorated with genuine taste, not merely expensive objects chosen for their price tags. The games remained scrupulously honest. Drunkenness was not merely discouraged but actively prohibited. Canfield hired staff who could maintain the atmosphere of a private club rather than a commercial vice operation. He also cultivated relationships with the local political establishment. He learned which officials needed to be paid and which preferred favors of other kinds. He became known as a reliable and discreet operator who caused no public embarrassments. When police needed to demonstrate activity against gambling, they raided his competitors. Canfield's establishment remained untouched year after year. The Providence operation prospered through the early 1880s. Canfield developed a reputation that spread beyond Rhode Island. Wealthy men traveling through New England heard about the gambling house where one could lose money in civilized surroundings. They visited, they played, and they told their friends. The clientele grew steadily more distinguished. During these years, Canfield began collecting art with serious intent. His purchases were modest at first, limited by his available capital, but he educated himself systematically, reading criticism and visiting galleries and auction houses whenever business took him to New York or Boston. He learned to distinguish genuine quality from fashionable reputation. He developed preferences and principles. He was becoming not merely a buyer of art, but a connoisseur. In 1885, Canfield married Genevieve Martin. Little is recorded about her background or their courtship. The marriage appears to have been stable, if unremarkable. Canfield maintained strict separation between his domestic and professional lives. His wife did not appear at his gambling establishments. He returned home each night to the routines of bourgeois respectability, then left each morning to oversee an illegal enterprise. The contradiction apparently troubled neither of them. By the late 1880s, Providence had grown too small for Canfield's ambitions. He had proven his concept. A gambling operation could attract wealthy and respectable clientele if managed with sufficient sophistication. Discretion and quality could command premium prices. Honest games actually increased profits because satisfied customers returned again and again. But Providence was a secondary city. The real money, the serious fortunes, the truly elite clientele, all of that was concentrated in New York. Manhattan in the late 1880s was entering its most extravagant era. The Industrial Revolution had created fortunes of unprecedented scale. Railroad barons and steel magnates and banking princes commanded wealth that dwarfed anything the nation had previously seen. These men needed ways to spend their money that matched their sense of their own importance. They needed pleasures worthy of their status. Canfield sold his Providence interests and moved to New York in 1888. He was 33 years old. He possessed a modest fortune, a refined understanding of wealthy men's desires, and a vision of what gambling could become in the right hands. He had no idea that within a decade he would operate the most famous illegal establishment in American history. He knew only that New York offered possibilities no other city could match. Providence had been the rehearsal. New York would be the main performance. The New York that Richard Canfield entered in 1888 was a city transformed by money on a scale the world had never seen. The Civil War had created fortunes. The railroads had multiplied them. Now a new generation of industrialists and financiers commanded wealth that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil controlled 90% of American refining. Andrew Carnegie's steel mills produced more than all of Great Britain. J.P. Morgan was beginning to consolidate the banking system under his personal authority. These men and their associates formed an aristocracy of wealth that dominated American life. The concentration of riches in Manhattan was staggering. By some estimates, 70% of the nation's corporate headquarters clustered within a few square miles of Lower Manhattan. The men who ran these enterprises needed to live somewhere. They needed to socialize somewhere, and they needed to play somewhere. The rigid propriety of their public lives created enormous pressure for private release. Behind closed doors, away from wives and ministers and newspaper reporters, the titans of industry wanted pleasures that matched their power. Gambling was technically illegal in New York State. The law had been on the books for decades and was periodically enforced with great publicity. But everyone understood that enforcement was selective. Poor men who gambled in back alleys faced arrest and imprisonment. Wealthy men who gambled in private clubs faced nothing at all, provided they chose their establishments carefully and the right people received their regular payments. This hypocrisy suited the political machine perfectly. Tammany Hall, the Democratic organization that controlled New York City, had refined corruption into a precise science. Every illegal enterprise paid tribute according to a well-understood schedule. Gambling houses paid police captains, who paid precinct commanders, who paid headquarters, officials, who paid the politicians, who appointed them all. The system was so orderly that operators could budget for protection as a fixed business expense. Raids occurred only when payments lapsed or when reformers generated sufficient public outrage to require a theatrical response. Canfield understood this system from his Providence experience. He knew that survival required not just paying the right people, but paying them reliably and generously. He also knew that the system offered opportunities for an operator clever enough to exploit them. The police would always protect gambling. The question was, which gambling houses would receive that protection? An establishment that caused no public embarrassments and paid promptly would be favored over competitors who attracted unwanted attention, but Canfield wanted more than mere survival. He wanted to create something unprecedented. He had observed the gambling landscape of New York during preliminary visits and found it disappointing. Most houses were crude operations catering to mixed clientele. The wealthy rubbed shoulders with confidence men and petty criminals. The rooms were dingy. The food was mediocre. The atmosphere suggested degradation rather than pleasure. A millionaire who lost $50,000 at such an establishment felt not merely poorer, but somehow soiled by the experience. Canfield believed he could offer something different. He would create a gambling house that felt like a gentleman's club. The rooms would be decorated with genuine taste. The staff would be impeccably trained. The food would rival the finest restaurants. The clientele would be carefully screened to exclude anyone who might embarrass the respectable patrons. A man could lose a fortune in such surroundings and feel that he had at least lost it elegantly. His first New York venture was modest. In 1888, he entered into partnership with David Duff, an established operator who controlled a gambling house near Madison Square. The arrangement gave Canfield access to Duff's political connections and protection network. In return, Canfield brought his Providence capital and his ideas about how a superior establishment might be run. The partnership was not equal, but it gave Canfield a foothold in the city. The Madison Square location had strategic advantages. The neighborhood was fashionable without being residential. Hotels and restaurants and theaters clustered nearby. Wealthy men could visit without traveling through areas where they might encounter their wives or business associates. The square itself provided a neutral meeting ground where an evening's entertainment could begin before moving to more private venues. Canfield spent the next several years learning the New York market. He studied which games the wealthy preferred and how they liked to play them. He observed the competition and noted their weaknesses. He cultivated relationships with potential patrons, meeting them at restaurants and clubs and art galleries. He never discussed gambling directly in these social encounters. He simply made himself known as a cultivated gentleman with interesting conversation and impeccable manners. By 1893, Canfield felt ready to establish his own independent operation. He acquired control of a gambling house at 22 West 26th Street, near the original Madison Square location. The purchase price and terms are not precisely recorded, but contemporary accounts suggest he paid somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 for the premises and the existing protection arrangements. In today's currency, that would represent roughly $2 to $4 million. The new establishment reflected everything Canfield had learned. He renovated the rooms extensively, installing fine woodwork and quality furnishings. He hired a French chef to prepare meals for patrons who wished to dine before or after gambling. He trained his staff in the protocols of high-end service. Dealers wore evening dress and addressed patrons with elaborate courtesy. Doormen screened visitors and turned away anyone who seemed unsuitable. The games themselves were conventional. Faro remained the most popular choice among American gamblers of the era. The game involved betting on which cards would appear from a dealing box. The house edge was small, typically around 1.5%, but sufficient to generate steady profits from high-volume play. Roulette and various card games supplemented the Faro tables. Canfield reportedly offered honest odds on all games, preferring to profit from volume rather than from cheating. This honesty was not merely ethical, it was strategic. Wealthy men could afford to lose. What they could not afford was the humiliation of being cheated. A gambler who lost fairly would return again, hoping to recover his losses through skill or luck. A gambler who suspected cheating would never return and would warn his friends to stay away. Canfield calculated that honest games would generate more profit over time than crooked ones, and the calculation proved correct. The 26th Street establishment prospered through the mid-1890s. Canfield developed a clientele of Wall Street speculators, corporate executives, and wealthy sportsmen. The financial boom of the era kept money flowing freely. Men who made fortunes during the day wanted to risk portions of those fortunes at night. Canfield provided an elegant venue for their impulses. But he was already thinking beyond 26th Street. The location was good, but not ideal. The neighborhood was beginning to change as the city expanded northward. More importantly, Canfield wanted a property that would make a statement. He wanted a building that would announce itself as the finest gambling establishment in America. He wanted a palace. He began searching for suitable real estate in the mid-1890s. His requirements were specific. The location had to be convenient to the wealthy but discreet enough to allow private comings and goings. The building had to be substantial enough to accommodate his vision, but not so large as to attract excessive attention. Above all, it had to have the right character. Canfield wanted a property with history and dignity, a building that would lend respectability to whatever occurred within its walls. In 1899, he found exactly what he was looking for. A brownstone at 5 East 44th Street had come onto the market. The building had once belonged to one of the Delmonico brothers, the family whose restaurant had defined fine dining in New York for half a century. The location was perfect. Delmonico's restaurant still operated a few doors away. The Murray Hill neighborhood remained fashionable. Fifth Avenue with its mansions lay just steps to the east. Grand Central Depot brought wealthy travelers from across the nation. Canfield negotiated the purchase through intermediaries. The price was reportedly around $200,000, equivalent to perhaps $6 million today. It was the largest investment of his life. But Canfield was not buying merely a building. He was buying the foundation for an empire. The brownstone at 44th Street would become the most famous gambling house in American history. Within its walls, fortunes would change hands on a scale that staggered even those who made and lost them. Artists and millionaires and politicians would pass through its doors, and eventually, inevitably, reformers would come to tear it all down. But that lay in the future. For now, in 1899, Canfield had secured his palace. The work of transformation was about to begin. The brownstone at 5 East 44th Street had begun its existence as a respectable family residence. Lorenzo Delmonico, one of the brothers whose restaurant had defined New York dining for generations, had owned the property and lived there with suitable bourgeois dignity. The building was 4 stories of solid construction with the heavy brownstone facade typical of Manhattan townhouses in the post-Civil War era. It was handsome without being ostentatious. It suggested wealth without screaming it. For Canfield's purposes, this discretion was essential. The location could not have been more perfect. Delmonico's restaurant still operated nearby at 44th Street and 5th Avenue. The establishment remained the undisputed pinnacle of American fine dining, the place where business deals were sealed and social alliances formed over elaborate French cuisine. Wealthy men who dined at Delmonico's could walk a few doors down to Canfield's establishment without the slightest inconvenience. The journey from dinner to gambling took perhaps 2 minutes on foot. 5th Avenue itself lay just steps to the east. The great mansions of the Gilded Age aristocracy lined the avenue in an almost unbroken wall of wealth. The Vanderbilts had built their famous Triple Palace at 51st Street. The Astors maintained their stronghold further south. Between these anchors clustered the homes of railroad presidents and steel magnates and banking princes. Canfield's clientele could reach his door from their own front steps in a matter of minutes. Grand Central Depot stood several blocks to the east on 42nd Street. The terminal brought wealthy travelers from across the nation directly into the heart of Manhattan. A businessman arriving from Chicago or Philadelphia could check into a nearby hotel and visit Canfield's establishment the same evening. The location served not merely local millionaires but the entire national elite. Canfield took possession of the building in early 1899 and began renovations immediately. The work would take months and cost a fortune. Contemporary accounts suggest he spent between $100,000 and $200,000 transforming the interior. In today's currency, that would represent between $3 and $6 million. It was an extraordinary sum for decorating a 4-story townhouse. But Canfield was not merely decorating. He was creating an environment. The ground floor presented the first challenge. Visitors would enter here, and their initial impressions would shape everything that followed. Canfield designed the entrance to suggest a private club rather than a commercial establishment. Heavy doors opened into a vestibule where a doorman assessed each arrival. Those who passed inspection proceeded to a reception area furnished with the quiet elegance of a wealthy home. Nothing about the space announced gambling. A visitor might have thought himself in the anteroom of a private library or a gentleman's study. The doorman's role was critical. Canfield instructed his staff to admit only those who belonged. Regular patrons were recognized and welcomed by name. New visitors required introduction by established members. Anyone who seemed unsuitable was turned away with polite firmness. Drunks were refused entry regardless of their wealth. Known troublemakers were permanently barred. The screening process ensured that once inside, a patron would encounter only his social equals or superiors. The upper floors housed the gambling rooms themselves. Canfield lavished particular attention on these spaces. He hired decorators who understood European taste and gave them essentially unlimited budgets. The walls were paneled in fine woods and hung with silk damask. The ceilings featured elaborate plasterwork. The floors were covered with oriental carpets of museum quality. Every detail was chosen to suggest permanence and cultivation. The furniture matched the setting. Canfield commissioned custom pieces from the finest craftsmen. The gaming tables were works of cabinetry as much as functional equipment. Chairs were upholstered in leather and built to support hours of comfortable play. Lighting came from crystal chandeliers and bronze fixtures that cast a warm glow across the rooms. The effect was of a private palace, rather than a place of business. But the most remarkable feature of the interior was the art. Canfield had been collecting seriously for years. Now he had walls worthy of his acquisitions. He installed paintings by established masters, alongside works by contemporary artists he admired. The collection eventually included pieces that would have been at home in any major museum. Visitors who knew nothing about art could sense that they were surrounded by valuable and beautiful objects. Those who did know about art were genuinely impressed. The crown of the collection was a portrait by James McNeill Whistler. The American-born artist had become the most celebrated painter of his generation, famous for works like the portrait of his mother that hung in the Louvre. Canfield had met Whistler through mutual acquaintances in the art world and commissioned a portrait of himself. The sitting took place in Whistler's London studio over several sessions. The resulting work showed Canfield in evening dress, gazing out with the calm self-assurance of a man who had mastered his world. Whistler and Canfield developed a genuine friendship during the portrait sessions. The artist and the gambler shared certain qualities. Both were self-made men who had risen through talent and determination. Both cultivated public personas that masked complex private selves. Both appreciated the finer things and had educated themselves to recognize quality. Canfield later acquired additional Whistler works for his collection. The portrait remained his most prized possession. The practical arrangements of the building received equal attention. Canfield understood that wealthy patrons would spend many hours on the premises. They would need sustenance. A dining room was established on the ground floor with a kitchen capable of producing meals rivaling any restaurant in the city. Canfield hired a French chef whose credentials were impeccable. The menu offered elaborate multi-course dinners for those who wished them, and simpler fare for those who wanted only to refuel between sessions at the tables. The quality of the food became legendary. Patrons compared the dining room favorably to Delmonico's itself. Some claimed it was actually superior. Canfield understood that the meals served multiple purposes. They attracted patrons who might not have come for gambling alone. They kept patrons on the premises longer, increasing the time available for play, and they reinforced the message that this establishment offered excellence in everything it did. Service throughout the building maintained the same standard. Canfield employed a staff of approximately 50 people during peak operations. Waiters in evening dress served drinks with silent efficiency. Attendants anticipated needs before patrons expressed them. A cigar room offered premium selections from around the world. Everything was designed to make wealthy men feel that they were being treated as they deserved. Security arrangements were necessarily elaborate. The building contained enormous sums of cash on any given evening. More importantly, the clientele included some of the most prominent men in America. Their presence at a gambling establishment was technically illegal and potentially embarrassing. Canfield installed multiple exits that allowed patrons to depart discreetly if circumstances required. Hidden passages connected rooms in ways that external observers could not detect. In the event of a police raid, the building could be emptied of patrons within minutes while staff delayed the officers. The staff itself operated under strict protocols. Dealers were trained to maintain absolute discretion about who they had seen and how much those patrons had won or lost. No employee was permitted to discuss the establishment's operations with anyone outside. Violations meant immediate dismissal without reference. The silence of the staff was essential to maintaining the trust of the clientele. Canfield also maintained careful relationships with the authorities. The building's protection required regular payments to various police officials and their political masters. The exact amounts are not recorded, but estimates suggest Canfield paid tens of thousands of dollars annually to maintain his immunity. These were simply operating costs, as predictable as rent or salaries. The payments bought not just protection, but advance warning of any planned enforcement actions. The transformation of 5 East 44th Street was complete by late 1899. Canfield had created something unprecedented in American gambling. The building was not merely a place where wealthy men could wager money. It was a temple to refined pleasure, a sanctuary from the moral constraints of respectable society. Within its walls, the rules that governed ordinary life were suspended. A man could pursue his desires in an atmosphere of beauty and discretion. Contemporary visitors struggled to describe what Canfield had achieved. Some compared the establishment to the private clubs of London. Others invoked the casinos of Monte Carlo. But the comparisons were imperfect. Canfield had created something distinctively American. His gambling house combined European sophistication with American energy. It offered the pleasures of the old world to men who had made their fortunes in the new. The building stood ready. The staff was trained. The games were prepared. All that remained was for the patrons to arrive and for the money to begin changing hands. Canfield had built his palace. Now he would discover whether the wealthy would come to worship there. By 1902, the Canfield Club had become the worst-kept secret among New York's millionaires. Everyone who mattered knew where it was. Everyone who mattered knew what happened inside. And everyone who mattered understood that discussing it publicly would mean permanent exclusion from its pleasures. The conspiracy of silence held firm year after year. Wealthy men protected their sanctuary by pretending it did not exist. A typical evening began around 10 o'clock, after the theaters had emptied and the restaurants had served their final courses. Carriages would appear on 44th Street, bearing passengers who gave no outward sign of their intentions. The men who emerged were among the most powerful in America: railroad presidents and steel executives, Wall Street speculators who moved markets with their decisions, politicians whose votes shaped national policy. They arrived in evening dress, as if coming from any respectable social engagement. The doorman recognized each arrival and admitted them without question. New visitors required introduction by established members. A stranger who attempted to enter would be turned away with polite firmness and no explanation. The screening was absolute. Canfield wanted no journalists, no reformers, no one who might compromise the discretion that made everything possible. Inside, the atmosphere combined tension and luxury in carefully calibrated proportions. The gaming rooms hummed with quiet activity. Dealers in evening dress operated the tables with professional precision. Waiters circulated with drinks and cigars. The Whistler paintings looked down from the walls, reminding visitors that they had entered a space where ordinary rules did not apply. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and French cologne, and the particular electricity that accompanies large sums of money changing hands. The games themselves were conventional by the standards of the era. Faro remained the most popular choice among American gamblers. The game was played with a standard deck dealt from a wooden box. Players bet on which cards would appear, with the house taking a small percentage on certain outcomes. The rules were simple enough for anyone to understand, but offered enough complexity to sustain interest through long sessions. Roulette attracted those who preferred pure chance to any pretense of skill. The wheel spun, and the ball bounced, and fortunes rose or fell on the physics of random motion. Canfield operated an American wheel with both 0 and double zero, giving the house an edge of approximately 5%. The mathematics guaranteed that players would lose over time. The psychology guaranteed they would keep playing anyway. Various card games supplemented the primary offerings. Poker was available for those who wanted to test themselves against other players rather than the house. Baccarat attracted the serious gamblers who favored games with simple decisions and high stakes. The specific games mattered less than the atmosphere in which they were played. Canfield had created an environment where losing money felt almost like a privilege. The stakes were extraordinary by any measure. The minimum bet at most tables was $25, equivalent to roughly $800 today. Many patrons wagered hundreds or thousands on a single turn of the cards. The house reportedly imposed no maximum limits. A man with sufficient funds could bet as much as he wished to lose. And lose, they did. The mathematics of gambling guaranteed that the house would win over time. Individual players might enjoy fortunate evenings or even fortunate weeks, but the longer they played, the more certainly they would surrender their money to the elegant establishment that served them so graciously. Canfield understood this truth perfectly. His job was simply to keep the patrons comfortable while the inevitable occurred. The sums that changed hands on a busy evening stagger the imagination. Contemporary accounts suggest that Canfield's tables might handle action of several $100,000 in a single night. In today's currency, that would represent several $1 million wagered between dinner and dawn. The house edge on this volume produced profits that made Canfield one of the wealthiest men in the city. Among the regular patrons, one name would later attract particular attention. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt was the son of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and heir to one of the largest fortunes in America. He was young, handsome, and possessed of more money than any reasonable person could spend. He was also a compulsive gambler who found in Canfield's establishment a worthy venue for his self-destruction. The stories about Vanderbilt's losses became legendary. Some accounts claim he lost as much as $300,000 in a single evening. Others suggest the total reached $500,000 over the course of his gambling career. The exact figures cannot be verified, but all sources agree that the sums were enormous. Vanderbilt inherited approximately $7 million when he came of age. A significant portion of that inheritance found its way into Canfield's coffers. Canfield himself maintained careful distance from the gambling. He never played at his own tables. He rarely even entered the gaming rooms during active hours. He observed from a distance, monitoring the operations through trusted subordinates. His role was that of a host rather than a participant. He welcomed guests and ensured their comfort. He did not share their compulsions. This detachment was both philosophical and practical. Canfield understood gambling with the clarity of someone who had studied it professionally for decades. He knew that the odds favored the house and that emotional involvement only clouded judgment. He also knew that a proprietor who gambled at his own establishment invited suspicion of cheating. His abstinence was proof of the game's integrity. The meals served at the Cow's 44th Street establishment became as famous as the gambling itself. Canfield's French chef produced cuisine that rivaled any restaurant in the city. Dinners began around 8 o'clock for those who wished to eat before gambling. The menu offered elaborate multi-course meals in the French manner. Soups and fish and game and roasts and desserts followed one another in stately procession. The wine cellar contained vintages that connoisseurs admired. Later in the evening, lighter fare was available for those who needed sustenance between sessions at the tables. Cold suppers and sandwiches and oysters on ice, coffee to sharpen the mind and champagne to celebrate victories. The kitchen operated until dawn, ready to serve whatever the patrons required. The food was not incidental to the gambling. It was part of the total experience that Canfield had designed. The quality of the meals served multiple strategic purposes. Excellent food kept patrons on the premises longer, extending the time available for gambling. It attracted men who might not have come for cards alone, but who would certainly play once they had eaten. And it reinforced the message that this establishment offered only the finest things. A man who had just consumed $100 dinner would not hesitate to wager $1,000 at the tables. Canfield's personal code governed every aspect of the operation. The games were scrupulously honest. The odds were exactly what they appeared to be. No cheating was tolerated from dealers or from patrons. A player who lost at Canfield's could blame only the mathematics and his own decisions. This integrity was not merely ethical. It was the foundation of the business. Wealthy men could afford to lose money. What they could not afford was humiliation. A gambler who suspected he had been cheated would never return and would warn every friend to stay away. The damage to reputation would far exceed any short-term gains from crooked dealing. Canfield calculated that honest games would generate more profit over years than dishonest ones, and the calculation proved correct. The discretion extended beyond the gaming rooms. Canfield never revealed the names of his patrons or the amounts they won or lost. The staff operated under strict instructions to maintain absolute silence about everything they witnessed. A man could lose his family's fortune in one evening and trust that no one outside the establishment would ever know. This privacy was perhaps the most valuable service Canfield provided. Annual profits from the 44th Street operation reportedly approached $1 million during the peak years. In today's currency, that would represent approximately $30 million in annual revenue. Canfield had become one of the wealthiest men in New York through the simple expedient of providing rich men with elegant opportunities to lose their money. The mathematics of gambling had made him rich. The psychology of gambling kept the customers coming back. But such visibility carried risks that Canfield understood even as he enjoyed his success. Reform movements were stirring across America. Progressive politicians saw in gambling an issue that could propel their careers. Newspapers were always hungry for scandals involving the wealthy and powerful. Canfield's empire rested on a foundation of corruption and discretion. If either crumbled, everything would fall. For now, however, the good times continued. The carriages arrived each evening, the doors opened for the elect, the games proceeded, the money flowed. Canfield watched from his private quarters as the machine he had built operated with profitable precision. He had achieved everything he had imagined during those years in Providence. He had created the finest gambling establishment in American history. He had no way of knowing that the destruction was already approaching. On the night of December 1st, 1902, Richard Canfield was hosting his usual clientele when the trouble arrived. Police officers appeared at the door of 5 Halfreek, Peter Metira de from East 44th Street, with warrants and determination. They had come not for a routine shakedown, but for a genuine raid. Someone had decided that the most famous gambling house in New York would finally face the consequences of its illegal operations. The man behind this assault was William Travers Jerome. He had been elected district attorney of New York County just 1 year earlier on a reform platform that promised to clean up the city's entrenched corruption. Jerome was ambitious, theatrical, and absolutely sincere in his hatred of the vice networks that Tammany Hall protected. He saw in gambling not merely a moral failing, but a symptom of the systemic corruption that poisoned democratic government. Breaking Canfield would make his reputation. Jerome was a peculiar figure for a reformer. He came from a prominent family and moved easily in the same social circles as Canfield's clientele. He knew personally many of the men who gambled at 44th Street. This knowledge fueled his outrage. Jerome believed that the law should apply equally to all citizens. The spectacle of wealthy men enjoying illegal pleasures, while poor men went to prison for the same offenses, struck him as fundamentally unjust. The December raid was carefully planned. Jerome had assembled evidence through informants and surveillance. He knew the layout of the building and the methods Canfield used to evade enforcement. He brought sufficient officers to seal all exits and prevent the usual dispersal of patrons and evidence. This would not be another theatrical gesture that accomplished nothing. Jerome intended to build a case that would stick. The officers entered to find the gambling rooms in full operation. Tables were active. Money was visible. Patrons scattered for the exits only to find them blocked. Canfield himself was on the premises, watching the destruction of everything he had built with characteristic composure. He did not resist. He did not protest. He simply observed as the police documented what they found. The raid made headlines across the city. Newspapers that had long known about Canfield's establishment suddenly discovered outrage at its existence. Reporters described the opulent interior and speculated about the prominent men who had gambled there. The conspiracy of silence that had protected the club for years evaporated overnight. Everyone was talking about the gambling king of 44th Street. Jerome pressed charges against Canfield personally. The specific accusations involved maintaining a gambling establishment and related offenses. Conviction could mean prison time, a prospect that would have terrified most defendants. Canfield retained excellent lawyers and prepared for a legal battle that would stretch over months. The legal proceedings revealed the delicate position in which Canfield found himself. His defense required him to maintain silence about his patrons. To reveal their names would destroy the discretion that had been his most valuable asset. It would also expose some of the most powerful men in America to public humiliation. Canfield understood that protecting his clients was more important than protecting himself. If he betrayed them, no one would ever trust him again. Jerome understood this calculus and tried to exploit it. He subpoenaed witnesses and demanded testimony about who had gambled at 44th Street. He threatened contempt charges against those who refused to answer. The legal maneuvering became as much a test of loyalty as of law. Canfield's patrons waited nervously to see whether their names would emerge. They need not have worried. Canfield maintained absolute silence throughout the proceedings. He accepted personal responsibility for everything while revealing nothing about his clientele. When pressed about specific gamblers, he refused to answer. When threatened with consequences for his silence, he accepted them stoically. His lawyers argued technical points of law, while Canfield himself took the moral high ground of discretion. The case dragged through 1903 and into 1904. Jerome won some battles and lost others. The evidence from the raid proved that gambling had occurred at 44th Street. But proving Canfield's personal criminal liability was more complicated. The legal system moved slowly, and each delay allowed Canfield to maintain some semblance of normal operations. During this period, Canfield's Saratoga establishment provided crucial support. The summer resort casino in upstate New York continued operating with less interference than the Manhattan House. Wealthy gamblers who had patronized 44th Street simply shifted their play to Saratoga during the racing season. The resort operation generated sufficient income to fund the legal defense and maintain Canfield's lifestyle. But the political tide was turning against gambling everywhere. The progressive movement was gaining strength across America. Reform candidates were winning elections in cities throughout the nation. The old arrangements between vice operators and political machines were collapsing under public pressure. Canfield could see that the world he had mastered was disappearing. The 44th Street establishment never fully recovered from the December 1902 raid. Operations continued in reduced form through the legal proceedings. Some patrons returned cautiously, but the atmosphere had changed. The sense of invulnerability was gone. Everyone understood that another raid could come at any moment. The magic that had made the place special had been broken. Jerome eventually secured a conviction on gambling charges in 1904. The sentence was relatively light, a fine rather than imprisonment. But the victory was symbolic rather than practical. Canfield had already accepted that his gambling career was ending. The question was not whether to close the 44th Street house, but when and how. The settlement of the criminal case included an agreement that effectively ended Canfield's New York operations. He paid substantial fines. He agreed to restrictions on future activities. Most importantly, he accepted that the era of elite gambling houses operating openly in Manhattan was over. The reformers had won this round of the endless American battle between vice and virtue. Canfield took the defeat with dignity. He made no public complaints about persecution or unfairness. He did not blame Jerome or the police or the newspapers. He simply acknowledged that circumstances had changed and adapted accordingly. The philosophical detachment he had cultivated through decades of studying Schopenhauer, served him well in adversity. The closing of 44th Street represented more than a personal setback for Canfield. It marked the end of an era in American gambling. Never again would an illegal establishment operate so openly and so elegantly in the heart of Manhattan. Never again would the wealthy enjoy such luxurious surroundings for their illicit pleasures. The reformers had not eliminated gambling, but they had driven it underground. Canfield himself remained wealthy despite the legal expenses. His years of profitable operation had accumulated substantial reserves. His art collection alone represented a fortune. He could live comfortably for the rest of his life without ever dealing another card. But something had been taken from him that money could not replace. He had built the finest gambling establishment in American history. He had created something unprecedented and unrepeatable. He had proven that vice could be elegant, and that elegance could make vice acceptable to the most discriminating patrons. Now all of that was gone. The Palace at 44th Street would never again host the evenings of refined corruption that had made it famous. The Saratoga operation survived a few more years. The summer resort had always been somewhat separate from the New York troubles, but the same pressures that had destroyed 44th Street eventually reached upstate as well. By 1907, the Saratoga Casino had closed permanently. Canfield's career as a gambling operator was finished. He was 52 years old. He had spent 3 decades in the gambling business. He had risen from a 6-month prison sentence in Providence to become the most famous gambling operator in America. He had made a fortune and lost some of it to lawyers. He had earned the respect of artists and the patronage of millionaires. Now he would have to find a new way to spend his remaining years. The reformers celebrated their victory. Jerome's reputation soared. He would later be considered for the presidency, though that ambition would not be fulfilled. The newspapers praised the cleanup of vice and predicted a new era of moral improvement. Everyone agreed that Richard Canfield had been defeated, but Canfield himself seemed almost relieved. The constant pressure of operating outside the law had worn on him. The payments to police and politicians, the fear of raids, the elaborate security measures, all of it had exacted a psychological toll. Now that burden was lifted. He could live openly without looking over his shoulder. He would reinvent himself as something the world had not expected. The gambling king would become an art collector of genuine distinction. The man who had taken money from compulsive gamblers would spend his remaining years among painters and critics and museum trustees. It was perhaps the strangest transformation in Gilded Age America. By 1904, the gambling rooms at 44th Street had fallen silent. The tables that had once handled hundreds of thousands of dollars each evening stood covered and unused. The staff that had served millionaires with such elegant discretion had been dismissed. The Whistler paintings still hung on the walls, but they looked down on empty rooms. Richard Canfield's Palace of Chance had become simply a very expensive private residence. The transition from gambling operator to art collector happened gradually rather than suddenly. Canfield had been collecting seriously for years while still running his establishments. The legal troubles and eventual closure of 44th Street simply accelerated a process already underway. He had always been more interested in beautiful objects than in the money they cost. Now he could devote himself entirely to that interest. His relationship with James McNeill Whistler had deepened during the difficult years. The two men had met through art world connections in the late 1890s. Whistler was then at the height of his fame, recognized as one of the greatest painters of his generation. He was also notoriously difficult, quick to take offense, and savage in his criticism of anyone he considered a Philistine. That he accepted Canfield as a friend and patron testified to the gambler's genuine cultivation. The portrait that Whistler painted of Canfield became the centerpiece of their relationship. The work showed Canfield in evening dress, gazing out with calm self-possession. Whistler captured something essential in his subject, the combination of refinement and ruthlessness that had made Canfield successful. The gambler appears completely at ease with himself and his circumstances. He might be a diplomat or a financier rather than the operator of an illegal enterprise. The sittings for the portrait took place in Whistler's London studio over multiple sessions. Canfield traveled across the Atlantic specifically for these appointments. The two men spent hours together, talking about art and life and the peculiarities of their respective worlds. Whistler was fascinated by the gambling business and asked endless questions about odds and psychology and the behavior of men under pressure. Canfield proved an ideal subject. He could sit motionless for hours without complaint. His face remained composed through session after session. He understood that the portrait required patience and gave it willingly. Whistler, who had driven other subjects to distraction with his demands, found in Canfield a sitter who met his standards for cooperation. The portrait was never formally completed. Whistler died in July 1903, leaving the work in an advanced but unfinished state. Canfield inherited the canvas as part of his friendship with the artist. He valued it above everything else in his collection. The portrait represented not just a work of art, but a relationship, a connection to a man he had genuinely admired. Whistler's death affected Canfield deeply. The artist had been one of the few people who accepted him completely, without judgment for how he had made his money. In Whistler's studio, Canfield was not a gambling operator facing legal troubles. He was a cultivated man with genuine taste and intelligent conversation. That acceptance meant more to Canfield than the portrait itself. After the closure of his gambling operations, Canfield devoted himself to expanding his collection. He had accumulated substantial wealth during his years in business. The legal expenses had been significant, but not ruinous. He retained enough capital to continue acquiring art at a serious level. He also retained the knowledge and taste that distinguish genuine collectors from mere accumulators. His collection grew to include works by many of the most respected artists of the era. He favored the Impressionists and their successors. He acquired paintings that represented not fashionable names, but genuine quality. Critics who visited his private gallery came away impressed by both the range and the discernment of his acquisitions. Canfield had become a collector whose opinion mattered. The art world accepted him more readily than respectable society had ever done. Museums and galleries welcomed his patronage. Dealers sought his business and valued his judgment. Critics consulted him about attributions and quality. In this world, his past as a gambling operator seemed almost romantic rather than disreputable. Artists had always associated with questionable characters. Canfield fit a recognized type. He also began writing about art with some seriousness. His essays on Whistler and other subjects demonstrated genuine knowledge and thoughtful analysis. He was not merely a wealthy collector buying prestige. He understood what he owned and could articulate why it mattered. His writing showed the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his gambling operations. The Saratoga Casino had provided a final chapter to his gambling career. The summer resort in upstate New York had operated somewhat independently of the Manhattan house. It served wealthy patrons who came for the racing season and stayed for the gaming tables. The establishment had a different character than 44th Street, more relaxed and seasonal, rather than an all-year operation. But the same reform pressures that destroyed Manhattan gambling eventually reached Saratoga. By 1907, the political climate had changed sufficiently that continued operation became impossible. Canfield closed the Saratoga establishment permanently that year. He was 52 years old and finished with the gambling business forever. The closure freed him from the last connections to his former life. He no longer needed to maintain relationships with politicians and police officials. He no longer needed to worry about raids or legal proceedings. He could live openly as what he had become, a wealthy private collector with refined tastes and interesting friends. His daily life settled into comfortable routines. He lived well but not ostentatiously. He continued reading philosophy and history as he had done since his youth. He corresponded with artists and critics and fellow collectors. He attended exhibitions and auctions and the social events of the art world. He had found a community that accepted him. But his health was beginning to decline. The years of stress had taken their toll. He suffered from various ailments that limited his activities. The energy that had built and operated the finest gambling establishment in America was gradually diminishing. He was becoming an old man, though not yet elderly by the calendar. His wife Genevieve remained a quiet presence in his life. The marriage had endured through all the turbulence of his career. She had never been publicly associated with his gambling operations. She had maintained her respectability while he operated outside the law. Now that he had become respectable himself, she could share more openly in his social life. Canfield's transformation puzzled some observers. How could a man who had made his fortune exploiting human weakness become a patron of the arts? How could someone who had profited from compulsive gambling appreciate the highest expressions of human creativity? The contradiction seemed too stark to be genuine. But perhaps there was no real contradiction. Canfield had always valued beauty and cultivation. He had always educated himself and sought the company of interesting people. The gambling business had been a means to an end rather than an end in itself. It had provided the wealth that allowed him to live as he wished. Now that he no longer needed the business, he could simply be what he had always wanted to be. The years after 1907 passed quietly. Canfield continued collecting and writing and living among his beautiful objects. He watched the art world evolve and kept pace with changing tastes. He maintained his friendships and made new ones. He had achieved something rare, a successful transition from one life to another, entirely different one. The portrait by Whistler remained his most treasured possession. He would sit before it sometimes, contemplating the image of himself as a younger man. The portrait showed him at the height of his powers, confident and commanding. The man who looked back from the canvas had built an empire. The man who sat before it had watched that empire crumble. But Canfield did not seem to regret the loss. He had played the game and lost, but he had played it well. He had created something remarkable and enjoyed it while it lasted. Now he had other things to appreciate. The Whistler portrait reminded him of what he had been. His collection reminded him of what he had become. He had less time remaining than he knew. In 1912, the brownstone at 5 East 44th Street was sold. The building that had once housed the most famous gambling establishment in America passed into other hands. The buyer intended to use the property for commercial purposes. The era of Canfield's Palace was officially over. The sale price reportedly approached $300,000. In today's currency, that would represent approximately $9 million. Canfield had originally purchased the building for roughly $200,000 and spent perhaps another $200,000 on renovations and furnishings. The sale recovered only a portion of his total investment, but Canfield was not in a position to negotiate aggressively. He needed the money, and the property had become a burden. The art collection also required liquidation. Canfield had accumulated paintings and objects worth substantial sums, but his financial situation had deteriorated since the closure of his gambling operations. Legal expenses and living costs had consumed his reserves. The collection that represented his genuine passion would have to be converted back into cash. The dispersal happened through a combination of private sales and auction. Major works went to established collectors who recognized their quality. The Whistler portrait remained with Canfield until the end. He could not bring himself to sell the image of himself painted by his friend. That single work represented everything the collection had meant to him. Other Whistler pieces found buyers more easily. The artist had died in 1903, and his reputation had only grown since then. Paintings that Canfield had acquired through his personal friendship now commanded prices that reflected posthumous fame. The financial return on these works was substantial. Whistler had been a good investment as well as a good friend. The auction records from this period reveal the range of Canfield's taste. He had collected not just Whistler but works by Manet and other Impressionists. He owned Dutch Old Masters and English portraiture. The collection was not vast by the standards of the great robber barons, but it was serious and coherent. Critics who reviewed the sales noted the quality of judgment that had assembled these works. Canfield watched his collection scatter with what observers described as philosophical resignation. He had always understood that ownership was temporary. The paintings would outlast him regardless of whether he sold them now or left them to heirs. Better to see them go to collectors who would appreciate them than to institutions that might store them in basements. The money from these sales sustained Canfield through his final years. He maintained a comfortable existence without the grandeur of his gambling days. He lived quietly, read his philosophy, corresponded with friends. The energy that had built an empire had faded into the calm of old age. He was 57 years old but seemed older. His health continued to decline through 1913 and into 1914. The specific ailments are not well documented, but contemporaries noted that he had aged significantly since the closure of his gambling operations. The stress of the legal battles and the loss of his life's work had taken a toll that comfortable retirement could not repair. Canfield spent his final months in relative seclusion. He saw few visitors beyond his wife and a small circle of friends. He continued reading and thinking about the subjects that had always interested him. He looked back on his career with what seemed like satisfaction rather than regret. He had done what he set out to do. The world had changed, and he had been forced to change with it. On December 11, 1914, Richard Canfield was walking in the subway station at 14th Street in Manhattan. The circumstances of what happened next are not entirely clear. According to reports, he fell while descending a staircase. The fall caused a skull fracture. He was transported to a hospital but died the following day from his injuries. He was 59 years old. The death was ruled accidental. There was no suggestion of foul play or suicide. Canfield had simply slipped on a staircase and suffered a fatal injury. The man who had built and lost a gambling empire died from a random accident in the New York subway system. The irony was almost too perfect. A man who had spent his life calculating odds had been undone by pure chance. The obituaries that followed struggled to categorize him. The New York Times called him a famous gambler and noted his art collection. Other papers emphasized his legal troubles and the raid that had ended his career. Some writers attempted to reconcile the contradictions. The cultivated aesthete who had profited from human weakness. The philosopher who had operated outside the law. His funeral was private. His wife Genevieve survived him, inheriting whatever remained of his estate. The Whistler portrait eventually found its way to a museum, where it hangs today as a record of an unusual friendship. The man in the portrait gazes out with the same calm self-possession he had shown in life. Nothing in the image suggests the turbulent career that lay behind that composed exterior. The immediate aftermath of Canfield's death was quiet. He had no children to carry on his name. His business had been closed for nearly a decade. The world he had inhabited, the Gilded Age world of millionaire gamblers and corrupt politicians and elegant vice, was already passing into history. The First World War had begun just months before his death. Everything was changing. The brownstone at 44th Street had already been transformed. The building that had housed Whistler paintings and faro tables and the most discriminating cuisine in Manhattan now served ordinary commercial purposes. Nothing about its exterior indicated what had once occurred within. The neighborhood was evolving as well. The old Murray Hill elegance was giving way to the Midtown commercial district that would dominate the 20th century. Canfield's contemporaries offered varied assessments of his legacy. Some praised his integrity, noting that he had never cheated his patrons or betrayed their names. Others condemned him as a corrupter of morals who had profited from addiction and weakness. The debate echoed broader American arguments about vice and virtue that continue to this day. What remained indisputable was his achievement. For a brief period around the turn of the 20th century, Richard Canfield had operated the most famous gambling establishment in American history. He had attracted the wealthiest and most powerful men in the nation to his tables. He had created an environment of such refinement that losing money there seemed almost worthwhile. No one before or since has quite replicated what he accomplished. The gambling king was dead. His palace was gone. His collection was scattered. But the legend would endure. If you walk along East 44th Street today, between 5th and Madison Avenues, you will find no trace of Richard Canfield's gambling palace. The brownstone that once housed Whistler paintings and faro tables has been demolished. A modern office building occupies the site. Nothing marks the location where fortunes changed hands and millionaires sought elegant ruin. The physical evidence of Canfield's empire has vanished completely. The neighborhood itself has transformed beyond recognition. Murray Hill's quiet elegance gave way decades ago to Midtown Manhattan's commercial intensity. The area around Grand Central Terminal now serves millions of commuters rather than wealthy gamblers seeking discretion. Delmonico's restaurant, which once anchored the social geography of Canfield's world, closed its original location long ago. The entire fabric of Gilded Age Manhattan has been woven over by successive generations of development. The Whistler portrait survived where the building did not. Canfield's most treasured possession eventually found its way to a museum, where it remains accessible to anyone who wishes to see it. The Cincinnati Art Museum acquired the work and displays it as part of their American collection. Visitors can study the image of Canfield in evening dress, gazing out with the calm self-possession that characterized him in life. The portrait outlasted everything else. Other pieces from Canfield's collection scattered to museums and private collections across the country. The works he acquired through genuine taste and cultivated judgment now hang in institutions he never imagined would want them. His eye for quality has been vindicated by time. The paintings he bought have appreciated enormously in value. The gambling operator proved to be a better art investor than many professional collectors of his era. Canfield himself has become a historical curiosity, remembered mainly by specialists in Gilded Age social history. His name appears in books about New York gambling and progressive-era reform. Historians mention him when discussing the relationship between wealth and vice in American culture, but he never achieved the lasting fame of the industrial magnates who gambled at his tables. The operator remains less famous than his clientele. This obscurity seems somehow appropriate. Canfield had always operated in shadows, providing pleasures that his patrons preferred not to acknowledge publicly. His business depended on discretion. He succeeded by remaining invisible to everyone except those who needed to find him. That invisibility has persisted into historical memory. The gamblers are remembered. The house is forgotten. The broader world that Canfield inhabited has also passed into history. The Gilded Age system of elite gambling protected by political corruption collapsed under progressive-era reforms. The arrangements that had allowed Canfield to operate openly in Manhattan became impossible to sustain. Never again would an illegal gambling house function so brazenly in the heart of the city. The reformers achieved at least that much, but the impulse that Canfield served proved more durable than the specific institutions he created. Americans continued gambling after Canfield's death, just as they had gambled before his birth. The activity moved to different venues and took different forms. Speakeasies during Prohibition offered games alongside illegal alcohol. Las Vegas emerged in the mid-20th century as a legal alternative. Atlantic City followed. Today, casinos operate in dozens of states, and online gambling reaches anyone with an internet connection. The numbers involved would have staggered even Canfield's wealthiest patrons. Americans now wager approximately $500 billion annually on legal gambling alone. The illegal market adds billions more. State lotteries generate revenues that fund education and public services. The activity that reformers tried to suppress has become a mainstream industry contributing to government budgets. This transformation represents perhaps the deepest irony of Canfield's legacy. He operated outside the law because gambling was prohibited. He paid bribes to corrupt officials because legal operation was impossible. He faced prosecution and eventual destruction because society deemed his business immoral. A century later, governments actively promote the same activities he was punished for facilitating. The arguments for and against gambling have barely changed since Canfield's era. Critics still warn about addiction and exploitation. They still note that the house always wins and that gamblers systematically lose money over time. They still point to the social costs when families are destroyed by compulsive gambling. The progressive reformers would recognize these arguments immediately. Defenders still counter that adults should be free to spend their money as they choose. They still argue that gambling provides entertainment and that most participants enjoy it responsibly. They still note that prohibition merely drives the activity underground, where it becomes more dangerous and less regulated. Canfield could have made these arguments himself. What has changed is the conclusion society draws from these arguments. The same behavior that sent Canfield into legal exile is now encouraged by television advertisements and government-sponsored lottery tickets. The same impulses that reformers called sinful are now called entertainment. The transformation has been so complete that most Americans would find Canfield's prosecution incomprehensible. Why would anyone go to jail for running a casino? Canfield himself might have appreciated this irony. He had always maintained that his gambling operations were honest and that his patrons came willingly. He had argued that wealthy men had the right to risk their money as they saw fit. He had insisted that his establishment provided a service that society wanted even if it pretended otherwise. History has vindicated these arguments, though too late to benefit Canfield himself. The man who emerges from the historical record remains difficult to categorize. He was genuinely cultivated, not merely rich. He read philosophy and collected art with discrimination that experts respected. His friendship with Whistler was real, built on shared interests and mutual appreciation. In another life, with different opportunities, he might have been a scholar or a museum curator or a patron of the arts who never touched a deck of cards. But he chose the path that circumstances offered. A boy from a declining whaling port with no education and no connections found his way to wealth through the one avenue available to him. He built something remarkable within the constraints of his era. He created the finest gambling establishment in American history and operated it with integrity that even his enemies acknowledged. When the system that had protected him collapsed, he adapted and reinvented himself as something more respectable. Perhaps that is the most American element of his story, the constant reinvention, the refusal to accept the identity that birth and circumstance assigned. Canfield made himself into a gambling operator when that served his purposes. He made himself into an art collector when gambling became impossible. He died neither as the criminal his prosecutors described, nor as the cultivated gentleman his friends admired. He died as something more complicated, a man who had been many things and might have been many more if chance had not intervened. The subway staircase where he fell offers no memorial. The 14th Street station processes thousands of passengers daily, none of them aware that a Gilded Age gambling king died there over a century ago. The spot is unmarked and unremarkable. Canfield passed from the world as quietly as he had once passed through the secret doors of his establishment, noticed only by those who knew what to look for. What remains is the story itself. A self-educated man from nowhere who built an empire on human weakness, a criminal who befriended one of the greatest artists of his age, a gambling operator who never gambled, a moralist who profited from vice. The contradictions never resolved themselves during his lifetime. They remain unresolved today. The brownstone at 44th Street is gone. The gamblers who lost fortunes there are forgotten. The reformers who destroyed Canfield's business are remembered mainly by specialists. But the questions his life raised persist. How do we judge a man who provided services society wants but cannot officially approve? What do we make of cultivation purchased with profits from exploitation? Where does the line fall between entertainment and predation? Canfield never answered these questions. He simply lived them. The portrait by Whistler hangs in Cincinnati. The gambling king gazes out at visitors who do not recognize him. His expression reveals nothing. The canvas preserves what the man himself could not preserve, a moment of composed certainty before everything changed. That image is what remains of Richard Canfield and his palace of chance. A painted face, a vanished building, a story that still troubles the American conscience. The cards have been dealt. The players have departed. The house stands empty.